Hi, good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us on this webinar entitled Busting the Myths of Kanban for Scrum Teams with Dave White. This webinar is brought to you by Swift Kanban from Digite. So the agenda for today's webinar is we'll have a quick set of introductions. We'll have a quick word from the sponsor, Digite, and then Dave will have his session where he will talk about busting the myths of Kanban for Scrum teams, and then we will leave some time for question and answers. So just I want to quickly introduce Dave White. Dave White is a principal consultant with Depth Consulting out of Calgary in Canada. He has been in IT for over 15 years. He's a very passionate advisor and mentor and coach on lean, agile, and ALM tooling. He has advised multiple companies and has been keynote speaker for various events. My name is Raghunath, and I head business development for Digite. Also, additionally, take care of customer support and professional services. Just to give you a broader background of Dave White, as I said, Depth Consulting is a Canadian consulting company which does boutique and niche consulting in the ALM area. They consult primarily around lean, agile, and ALM methods. He has been associated with the lean Kanban movement right since its inception. He has served on the management board of Lean Kanban University and has also been on the advisory board for LKU's accredited Kanban training program. He also is the program director of the KCP program at the Lean Kanban University. A quick word from the sponsor. Digite is a web-based collaborative product solutions company for geographically distributed teams. We are headquartered in California. We are based out of Cupertino. We have close to 1 million users who use our systems across the Americas, Europe, Asia, and Africa. We essentially have products that cover lean and Kanban methods, agile ALM, as well as project and portfolio management. Swift Kanban is our flagship lean Kanban product. When software teams do Kanban and Scrumban kind of work, Swift Kanban comes into play. So we've seen customers use it in software development, in other parts of IT, as well as DevOps. We see a lot of its adoption happening both on the software side of things as well as on the infra side of things. We believe that we are one of the leading providers of Kanban and Scrumban tools in the world. We also scale this up to the enterprise level, where essentially you can do portfolio and enterprise services planning, where you have large teams that can have hierarchies of cards and boards, starting off with your stories and epics and themes and so on and so forth. So as I mentioned to you earlier, we offer portfolio Kanban and enterprise services planning capabilities for enterprise level scaled agility and Kanban methods. We worked with David Anderson on the enterprise services planning, and we've had some very encouraging results. One of the key things that we do in the portfolio Kanban and enterprise services planning is the ability to have hierarchically linked cards as well. So you could have themes which have links to epics and epics to capabilities and capabilities to features. So have these kind of linkages. that can then be very useful in terms of uh, the overall team level and portfolio level tracking of your themes. Along with that, we also provide you with some fairly sophisticated risk management capabilities under different dimensions. Each card can be ranked on a real-time basis for risk management, and this can then be a living, breathing thing as far as risk management is concerned. Now that combined with the capability of what Dave was talking about, to move away from deterministic forecasting to probabilistic forecasting, makes it a fairly compelling case where you can do demand and capacity planning using probabilistic forecasting. We use the Monte Carlo simulation to do this, and we would encourage some of you to have a look at this. Apart from the IT community, we've also had people use it in various other domains like marketing, HR, procurement, legal, and so on and so forth. It also allows you to do some personal Kanban work as well. So you could plan events, do family chores, and so on and so forth. All this is backed by some fairly sophisticated analytics, including cumulative flow diagrams, throughput that Dave was talking about. We have some fairly good, control charts. We also track flow efficiency, cycle time, and so on and so forth. We also do, blocking analysis, and that gives us a lot of good insights in terms of action items and so on and so forth. So these are some of our key customers. Just wanted to leave this logo with you. Amazon uses us globally with a lot of their work. United Healthcare. And among the large SIs, we have companies like Cognizant, Infosys, and Wipro use our solutions. What I would now do is hand over the session to Dave.
You bet, I'm ready to go.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Raghu and Shipra. Could you guys see my screen all right?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you guys for everybody for taking time out of your day to come and listen to me talk about some of these myths that Scrum teams often have about Kanban. I've had a pretty good introduction so far, so I'll let these slides go, and just so they can be there for the recording. And if you have any other questions, or if you need the information for yourself later on. One thing I wanted to talk to you guys about, though, about my approach, and it's not just mine, it's coming from Lean Kanban itself, is that there's a focus on pragmatic, actionable guidance. And I hope that from this webinar, you can take something away and start doing it right away. If you came to a Lean Kanban class that we delivered or any kind of guidance, we would hope you would take something away from that so that you can start using this right away, tomorrow, whatever works best for you. But that's really important to me and the way that I approach these kinds of things. So I wanted to tell everybody and share everybody that I do believe Kanban and Scrum can coexist. And I have some goals that I'm hoping that will shine through in this presentation today. I would like you guys to be able to identify challenging topics within your organization after you've seen me do it a little bit. I would like you guys to be also not have a fear of trying to do some of these activities. I want you guys to be able to be encouraged to explore how these things can coexist to varying degrees. And then hopefully we'll introduce some new concepts to people who haven't seen any of this stuff before. So one of the things that's important, and I hope that you hear this from every Lean Kanban practitioner that you ever talk to or ever have a conversation with, is that can Kanban and Scrum live together? And the answer should be yes. The very first principle in the Kanban method is start with what you do now. So if you are currently a Scrum team, every Kanban practitioner should feel that that's important and respect that and start with that. So that should make it relatively easy for anybody who's listening to feel like we're not going to try and force something on you. We're not trying to say that there's only one way. We want to discover new ways of working and take that chance. So practically speaking, I wanted to cover off four sort of key areas where I see a lot of concern, worries with Scrum teams when they are adopting Kanban. So we're going to talk a little bit about the sprints and iterations and cadences and how we can evolve our understanding of that. We'll talk about WIP limits, we'll talk about lead time, and then we'll talk about this NoEstimates thing, which is a bit of a catchphrase, but it's good for us to leverage that talking point and find out what it's really about. So first we'll talk about sprints and iterations. So you may have heard some of these statements before. Scrum is for complex work. Kanban is for simple work. And I think that this comes from this, division of, well, simple work doesn't need to be planned or it's repeatable. And so that's what Kanban's good for. And we need Scrum for complicated project work. Or, even take that division further, we'll say that Scrum is for product teams and Kanban is for service teams. And it's my belief that these statements exist because there's this resistance within the Scrum community to iterationless development, which certainly feels like an attack on Scrum. But that's actually not the case of what Kanban is trying to do or suggesting that we do. There isn't a requirement that you do iterationless development in Kanban. And we can take as much or as little bit of the idea of this from Kanban and apply it to our Scrum teams pretty easily. I'll hopefully show you. But hopefully if you've heard these words, Scrum is for complex work, Kanban is for simple work, or it's for product teams, or it's for service teams, just get that out of your head. Those are just myths. And we definitely can use these two things together in complex and simple on product teams or on service teams. So let's talk about the sprint for a moment. The sprint is a pretty simple thing. It is a time box. Usually it's 2 to 4 weeks. In my experience working with teams, the Scrum Guide says it shouldn't be longer than 1 month, and it can definitely be shorter. The sprint as a time box has activities at the beginning and activities at the end. And usually we stack a whole bunch of them together until we've got our product done. And the sprint has a lot of really positive benefits. We get consistent scheduling. We get control of the work selected on a periodic basis. So the goal for the sprint, it allows us to take in some work. We get to choose what we're doing, and then we get to work, relatively uninterrupted for a couple of weeks or a month. The other couple of benefits is there's an end to it, which is a positive thing. We always like to get something done. And for our customers, there's always a point in time when they would like to get the product or get something. Usually they're the ones, in the enterprise, they're the ones paying for it, or in the internet, customer-facing websites or stuff like that, they're the ones asking for it and they really want this feature. So they're excited when they get stuff on a more frequent basis. Now, when I've been mentioning those things, I've been trying to use this word that we have activities and we do them on a periodic basis. And that's where in the Kanban method, we actually call these things cadences. And cadences are good. I just told you the benefits of the sprint. Well, cadences have those same benefits. So a cadence is a periodic event where something happens. And, if you look on Oxford, I think it was rhythm or metrical beat. So we get this consistent approach to doing things. And as knowledge workers, we like consistency in certain activities. We like to know when things are happening. So if we were to take a sprint and say every 2 weeks we were going to do an iteration plan, and then, we'll do an iteration planning meeting, then we'll do 2 weeks of work, and then we'll do an iteration review, a retrospective, and then we'll do it again and do an iteration plan. We do that every 2 weeks. If we were to use the word cadences, we can say every period, whatever that is, we can do any of these activities. We can schedule work. We can schedule important collaborative activities, which is sprint planning and iteration review and retrospective. And we can potentially deliver a bit of product if we have that delivery cadence that's happening at the end of each sprint. One of the challenges that I find with teams that are practicing Scrum is that there is a organizational desire to stretch these out or to deviate from them a little bit, but that gets kind of hard when you have all these activities sort of attached to the end of the time box, and they all sort of have to happen here in this fashion, which is not to say that they have to. Scrum does allow you a lot of flexibility, but the cultural belief of what the sprint is should evolve and change a little bit, but it does have that belief that we do these things every 2 weeks. Whereas with cadences, they get to emerge on demand, and in so doing, they increase the flexibility. So cadences for planning and work selection. Let's say we would like to do something every 2 weeks. We can use a bi-weekly cadence to do work selection. Maybe we can only meet with the product owner or meet with the business every 2 weeks. So this is a good this is a good fit. Maybe we would like to deliver product a little bit more frequently than that. Or maybe we don't have any product delivery. We have a CI/CD pipeline, and our product just gets delivered when the story is done. In that case, we don't actually need a cadence. So we just don't have to worry about planning that. Let's say that we have demo environments and we want to demo our product to the business or to customer segments a little bit more frequently than what we would do a full product release. Maybe let's do that weekly. The way that we do these cadences and the way that we talk about them in the Kanban community, it allows us to disconnect them and allow them to happen where they're most advantageous to occur. So do we need to meet weekly to talk about retrospectives? Maybe we haven't done enough in a week to warrant it. Maybe we can do that once a month. So there's lots of ways that we can have periodic, repeatable events, but they don't all have to be tied together, and they can be purposefully applied to the organization's needs of when they should occur. So the cool thing about cadences and Scrum teams is that there's actually no sort of barriers to adoption. We can do as much or as little as we're comfortable with, and if it doesn't work, we just change it and go back, or go back. If you feel like everything is working fine with regard to the sprints, you don't have to add cadences. You don't have to change it. But if you are having challenges with certain activities and when they feel like they are best applied to your organization, you can maybe potentially explore these new techniques of calling these things cadences in addition to calling them a sprint, or don't call them a sprint and call them cadences. So my little bit of practical ask for this section, this particular myth, is to think about your sprint in the form of cadences. So once every 2 weeks, we will collaborate to fill our backlog. Maybe we can call that a bi-weekly replenishment meeting and see how that feels. We will meet daily to discuss the current state and plan for the day. That can be a stand-up. We can call that a Kanban meeting, where we discuss the state of our Kanban system. We can, once every 2 weeks, have a demo for our customers. And in the Kanban language, we'd call this a bi-weekly cadence for a product demo. And finally, we can have a activity where we reflect on our team's delivery capabilities and how we're behaving and how we're delivering every 2 weeks, and we can call it a service delivery review. So if you are having challenges with when these periodic events happen in Scrum, maybe you can start to call them slightly different names, and then maybe start to play around with tweaking the period of the cadence. And so we can start to disconnect these a little bit from the sprint. And again, if you don't have a problem with sprints and sprint activities, this is not something that you need to deal with at this point in time. So that was talking about sprints. Now we're going to talk about WIP limits. So WIP limits are something that's actually seems to cause a lot of anxiety in teams. People think like, oh, well, I've got a work in progress limit. That's what WIP means. Sorry if I didn't introduce that. WIP is work in progress. So these limits, like, oh, well, if there's a limit in place on what work I can start, then I can't start work and I'll be sitting around doing nothing. And that's actually not really a healthy understanding of WIP limits. And a healthier way to describe WIP limits is that they're our approach, the Kanban community's approach to picking the work that we feel that we can accomplish and being allowed to focus on finishing that work before starting or being interrupted by new work. So Scrum teams already do have WIP limits, and their WIP limit is the iteration plan, the sprint plan. When we decide that we're going to have this 2-week period or whatever the duration of your sprint is, we are going to pull in the work that we think that we can accomplish in that period of time, and we are going to be allowed to focus on that mostly. There isn't any rules that say that we can't necessarily add work to the sprint. I think culturally it's a hard mentality to change, that you are actually allowed to add stuff to the sprint because of past guidance on the sprint from the Scrum Guide. But Scrum teams already have WIP limits in place. Now, the other cool thing about WIP limits is that we generally advise them to be optional initially. So WIP limits are a policy that helps guide us towards good behavior of starting and finishing work. And I would say that any team that is starting to take on a Kanban flavor of doing their work, or a Kanban transformation of some sort, doesn't need to initially require WIP limit policies. These are emotionally difficult for organizations, and they should be introduced as you guys become more experienced with what they are and how they behave and how your organization will adapt to these particular WIP limits. The good thing for Scrum teams is that the organization is probably already used to WIP limits because of the sprint plan. They're used to Scrum teams saying, we can work on these stories. And we've seen these benefits for both Kanban and for Scrum, where we reduce overburdening, we reduce multitasking. Because we're doing small increments, we have fewer stories that become abandoned or discarded, so we reduce waste and we become more predictable. So Scrum teams have used WIP limits for sure. Now what we call this kind of WIP limit policy is what we call a CON-WIP. There's a constant work in progress limit for a period of time. So we say we are going to work on 25 points worth of stories, or 5 larges, or whatever it may be, whatever your estimation technique is. We're going to work on that many stories for a period of time, whatever your sprint duration is. And when the sprint's done, we go through a planning exercise, and the business or our customers recognize that we are going to only pull in what we think we can accomplish in those 2 weeks. So that is definitely a work in progress limit. Again, what we call a CON-WIP policy. Where this starts to get a little bit harder for Scrum teams is that Kanban teams generally consider this a fairly coarse-grained piece of work. So what we see on Scrum teams we see a sprint backlog and say there's 25 points of something, or there's 25 stories, or whatever that 25 means. But there's no limits in place throughout the rest of the workflow. And I'm not sure if it's happening at your organization, but I've certainly seen it where, you know, the backlog, everything moves into analysis as soon as the iteration starts, because people need to start working. And then everything moves into dev, and then everything moves into testing. And then at the end of the sprint, testing is like, there was so much work, we didn't get a chance to finish our testing. And at the end of the sprint, the analysts are like, wow, how, you know, we've got no work. And you just see this shifting, overburdening through the Scrum team, depending on the composition of your team. If you have lots of devs, then you're going to see, you know, a burden land on test, which is unfortunately what I see a lot of times, is that there's only 1 or 2 testers on a team, and then all this dev work falls on them, and we don't get enough testing done to get the sprint completed, or we start to make compromises, and our teams aren't necessarily balanced for the capability inside, which is what WIP Limits are trying to do. They're trying to balance out and give us a capability understanding through these activities in our workflow. So this is what a Scrum team will look like. We have a WIP limit there at the beginning, but we don't have any intra-process. What it should be relatively easy then for a Scrum team to do is take the next step, is move to WIP limits on a per activity or a per state policy. And what this does is allows us to break our workflow into these canonical practices or activities, and then we get to try to optimize how work flows into and through those particular activities so that we get a more balanced approach to delivering work. So here's another option for Scrum teams that they can just start to try. So if we have 25 points in our sprint backlog, is it possible, or could you try to put WIP limits on the different activities that are on your board, and just say, okay, if there's this many in this particular column, then you can't start pushing work downstream. You have to start pulling the work. The same way that you've asked the organization to let you pull work into the sprint, now we can allow ourselves to pull work into these activities and try to get a better sense of flow. And this doesn't mean that analysts don't work when the devs are full and they have done their work. It doesn't mean that testers don't accept work if the developers are done. What it means is that we focus as a team on getting activities through those activities, getting work through those activities with better flow. So is it possible, if there's dev work waiting or dev work completed, but the testers are overburdened, that the analysts could go and help do testing, or even developers help do testing? That allows us to focus on getting work completed and done versus starting it, which is, you know, one of the things that we say in the Kanban community: stop starting, start finishing. WIP limits certainly help us do this particular activity. Now, another problem that I see quite often in Scrum teams is that they actually have shared responsibilities. So if I was in the room, I'd ask you to all raise your hand. Who here as a team has to deal with emergent work, things that we didn't expect to happen in the sprint plan, like a severity one or a live site incident or a prior one, or, you know, maybe there's like you know, it's not a live site incident, it's some other emergent work that's really important, but it doesn't fit within the sprint planning cadences. You know, how do Scrum teams handle these expedites for non-product oriented work? You know, we can very easily work with, you know, shifting priorities within the backlog and shifting priorities within the sort of daily activities, but what if it's not a part of the sprint backlog? So we in the Kanban community have a very specific visualization. There's lots of them. This is just going to be one of them, but we do have specific practices on visualizing, preparing for this emergent work. So if you're a Scrum team and you have this shared responsibility, is it possible for you to create an expedite lane, which is a lane that has a WIP limit of 1, just we can only really sort of deal with one fire at a time. But when that work is there, we can see it, and it's allowed to be brought into our sprint. The expedite lane does have this policy where it preempts product work, but it doesn't. It's one at a time. It gets our team focused on getting the expedite done and then getting back to our product work. So if this is something that your Scrum team is dealing with, this is another way where we can apply a horizontal WIP limit through the workflow to give ourselves some capability, gives ourselves some permission to do non-product oriented work that is a part of our work. Now, the other thing you can do here is if you have, say, 50% of your time is spent doing operational work, supporting products, and 50% of your time is spent doing product work, we could actually make that expedite lane, maybe not an expedite, maybe it's ops work, and we could give it a bigger WIP limit that shows that we are doing a balanced approach to bringing work into our team to do. So this is something else that you can also try for this emergent work, which isn't an easy thing for Scrum teams to plan and to use in their sprint plan. So you can try either of these two techniques. You can either add WIP limits onto your activities, and if you have emergent work, try and add an expedite lane. That just sort of elevates it visually, gives yourselves permission to bring it into your team's workflow and focus on getting it done. So one thing that with WIP limits, we are managing flow. We are trying to give ourselves policies of good flow through our team and through the organization now, potentially. So one of the things I always ask my Scrum teams is, are you isolated within the organization? Are you the only part of the organization that is a part of the delivery to the end customer? Who are your partners? And can we encourage them to manage flow across our teams and the various services that are present within the organization? When you start managing WIP and you start managing flow, we can start now to build a network, a visualization of the various activities that your organization might need to do to get a product out to the end customer. So we have a customer out there who's saying, hey, I want this feature for your particular product. Maybe sales goes in there and they analyze whether this is, it has a lot of demand, it's worth investing in, and they say, yes, this is something that we want to invest in. Then it goes off to the development team. They actually build the feature. Then it goes to an ops team for delivery or for preparation for giving it to the customer. And then we have to have marketing and training do their bit of work. And then finally the customer can see it. So these are some of the organizations within an organization that are involved in satisfying customers doing their work. Once you're managing WIP and managing flow across all these organizations, you have a much better chance of visualizing and delivering to your customers in a more holistic fashion. So that's, WIP limits, and you can do as much or as little as you want. If you want to try putting a WIP limit on a single column, if you want to try putting a WIP limit inside of your Scrum teams and all of the activities, go ahead, give it a try. WIP limits are not laws. Like, nobody's going to be sent to jail if they violate a WIP limit. But they are policies that guide us towards good behavior in achieving a smooth flow of work through our teams. And so I would encourage you to definitely try and just start trying applying them, and don't be afraid to explore and experiment and change them around and see what benefits that you can see from them. So now that we're managing flow potentially, there's something else, like we don't really have a good sense of what we are capable of. Scrum teams don't measure lead time. We tend to measure story points or ideal days, or maybe it's just even a number of stories. And then we turn these somehow, this work into a velocity. that is a Scrum team's measurement of capability. The only thing about this is that it's hard to add t-shirt size, so we convert them to something else. It's ideal days are never ideal. Ideal hours are super hard to manage. So the traditional agile estimation techniques for sizing and for velocity have always been a challenge. It's been a challenge on every Scrum team I've been on. What are we really trying to measure here? There's a whole bunch of things conflated inside of these various things. Is it complex? Is it take a long time to do? Are those two things kind of mixed up inside of a story point? And is it even really that important? Do we need to measure? Do we need to do these estimates? Or can we just use a simple, easy to use metric like lead time? So I want to say Scrum teams can do this easily. You guys already have a starting column, and you already have a done column. And we can debate whether the done is delivered or done is done as far as you're concerned, but this is already something that's really easy for Scrum teams to do because they already have these points where they commit to something and they deliver something. The only thing that is really sort of different is that we just take the delta between those two dates. It's not guessing. There's no trying to game the system, which I have seen done in estimates, unfortunately. But we can do this very easily. So we have two capabilities in Kanban. Lead time is the one we'll talk about today, but there's also throughput, so how many items per period, which is comparable to what Scrum teams do today. Throughput is a concrete work item per period, as opposed to story points. So we will leave throughput for another day, and we'll just talk about using lead time as a way to measure how long a thing, I'm going to use that word thing in quotes, to get something done using just a concrete time, a start and stop time. So when did you commit to something? That's day 1. When did you deliver it? That's day 5. The delta between those two things is going to be 4. So our ability to deliver that story was 4 days. And it was really simple to do, and it's easy to capture. So it is pretty easy. So once you start to do this, and you might be able to do this in your tool today if you're using Jira or version 1 or TFS or something like that, you can probably go get this information already and determine what your lead times are. And with our lead times, we can now start to look at our team's historic ability to deliver things. And this is everything. Everything that your team does, every work item that appears on your board influences your team's overall capability, historic capability to deliver items. And so once we've started to gather this information, we can really quantify our capability to deliver items in a concrete fashion. We can allow things that impact our delivery capability. So if we have delays in our development process or our delivery process, the lead times give us a way to sort of quantify those delays or see them. We can start to tell our customers with a bit more certainty what we're capable of doing. And again, we do get that deeper understanding of where those delays are coming from. So lead time, again, I believe this is really easy to do. This is something that you should be able to go off and do, like starting tomorrow. So on a work item or a PBI user story, manually capture. If you're lucky and you have a tool that's capturing this for you already, that's great. But just write down on it the date it was accepted into the sprint and the date when it was done. And done, I mean, not necessarily delivered, because sometimes the delivery happens later by a different team. So whenever it's done for your team. And then just calculate the difference in whole days. And just start to do that. And write those whole day numbers down on your work item. And then just start to explore that information. That information will probably cause you to think about what you're doing and how you're doing it and what you're saying and what you're capable of delivering to your customers. and in the fashion in which you're able to deliver it to them. So finally, we're going to do this last little bit, which people hear NoEstimates. It's also called probabilistic forecasting, which is probably a better term for what we're actually doing. NoEstimates is a cultural movement that started on Twitter. I think it's a good movement, but what we probably want to do is start thinking about this as probabilistic forecasting. So I want to get it out there right away. NoEstimates is not an excuse to stop providing predictions. It is not an excuse to be lazy, and it is not chaos or the Wild West. There are people who are, I think the word might be afraid, concerned about the NoEstimates movement. Oh my God, what are we going to do if we don't estimate? And that's actually not at all what NoEstimates movement was about. The NoEstimate movement was a community-based response to the failure of traditional agile approaches to doing planning. And I got to say, this isn't in the Scrum Guide. The Scrum Guide provides no guidance on how you actually do estimations. This is just grassroots agile estimation techniques as they've been applied by whoever learned it, a way to do it, and whenever they learned to do it. And then the team coming together and deciding this is the way. But we have learned, and this isn't just in our industry, we've learned this in a lot of industries, that we can do a lot better. We can use statistics and observe behavior to predict the future. We do this in weather forecasts, we do this in structural analysis, we do this in manufacturing defect analysis. There's no reason that we can't do this in software development or any kind of knowledge work scenario where we are trying to understand what we are capable of doing statistically so that we can become better at predicting the future based on past behavior. We've also learned that we don't necessarily need to estimate everything. And sometimes not estimating is appropriate. If there is no choice to be made based on the estimate, you're going to do a piece of work or not, you don't necessarily need to estimate it. You're just going to go and start working on it. And one last little thing about no estimates or not estimating is not to say that we shouldn't be doing an analysis of the future. An estimate is a thing that we deliver. An analysis of the future is something that we need to do to better understand it. So let's not confuse that by me saying we don't need to estimate. It doesn't mean that we don't need to explore and analyze the future. It just means that we don't need to worry about coming up with a number or something that says, when will it be done? We're just going to get it done, and we're going to do all of the collaborative, beneficial work that's required to get that thing done, no matter what. So, probabilistic forecasting, how do we start with this? Well, we find that we need probably a fairly concrete measure of delivery capability. And now we have that through lead time. Over a period of time, we look at this sort of quantitative data, and then we start to think about our data in a distribution. All of our stories are not going to be 1 day or 2 days or 3 days lead time. There's going to be a whole range of stories that, sometimes they get done in 1, sometimes they get done in 2, sometimes they get done in 5 or 10. All of our stories are on this spectrum. And when we think about a probabilistic forecast, we think about this whole spectrum. So any story that comes into our team could fall somewhere into this lead time distribution. It can be the most likely to occur, which is the purple line at the beginning of the mode. That's the most numbers. But it also could be something that took a long time, and it could be something down the back end of that tail. Which of these stories is it that you're pulling? What should you tell your customers? You will start to have a better understanding of where particular stories will be, but instead of saying that you're going to deliver a story on the purple line to your customers, you could say, well, 85% of the time we're going to deliver it before the orange line. Is that good enough? And this is where we start to get into what probabilistic forecasting and understand the reality that there isn't a discrete number that we can use to give our customers one number that they will be happy with, that we are 100% likely to achieve. So again, practical guidance on this. If you start to capture lead time, just plot it on a histogram like you saw in the previous slide, and then look at what your curve looks like. Maybe you can ask before you do this plot, what did you expect it to look like, and what does it say about your process? If you have lead time, which is really easy to do, you can start to create a histogram, and you can start to look at what you're producing and what you're capable of producing. And then you can start to use some of these other tactics to tweak it and see if you can get improvements, all of this, and then you can tell your customers with a different story. We are very likely to get this done in 10 days. Is that good enough for you? And it could be 1 or 8, but most of your stories get done in 10 days, and your customer's like, yeah, sure, that's okay. So there's a lot of resources. That's a pretty deep topic. I just wanted to introduce it to you as a learning slide and to show you where you can take your lead time to next. But these are some good resources. I would definitely say to go to Troy McGinnis's page, Focus Objectives. Larry, Frank, and Alexi have all done great work. That distribution slide you saw was from Alexi Zegloff in his Connected Knowledge blog. I would definitely go and start reading some of this work that these guys are doing about probabilistic forecasting. So that's pretty much it. Those are me, hopefully practically showing any Scrum team that they can approach Kanban with safety, with confidence, take as much or as little, but there are definitely some benefits that you can practically get right away from some of these techniques that we're learning about. So I'm just going to leave these questions with you guys for a few minutes here. If you came to this webinar as a Scrum advocate, I would just like you to reflect on, did you see anything that you didn't feel fit within the Scrum Guide? Is there anything that you saw that was forbidden? I'm not sure that the Scrum Guide forbids anything, but did you anything that you felt was forbidden? Or did you see anything you could use tomorrow or anything that you couldn't use? I think these questions are really important for us to ask ourselves so that we can go on and just challenge our assumptions and grow. If you came here as a Kanban advocate, I hope that you realize that we can have Scrum and Kanban living together. And yes, we're all very passionate about what we love. I'm very passionate about Kanban, and I will encourage everybody to move towards Kanban. I'm not going to make them move if it's not comfortable for them. We have to be respectful. We have to be compassionate. And if Scrum is what they know and they love, we don't have to move them off of that. So I hope if you are a Kanban advocate, if you just ask these questions yourself. And if you're a process agnostic, did you see anything that you would like to try today? These are just tools that we can apply to our process to improve it. Hopefully we have some desired outcomes. Hopefully you're here because you have a sense of I could be better in my process, or I could be better in my delivery, and maybe there was a tool here that you discovered we can maybe try applying, because these are just about having problems, desiring outcomes, and then applying tools and seeing which ones work. I don't know exactly what's going to work in your organization. I know that these particular tools at their basic levels are pretty easy to do and they're pretty powerful, but we have to learn how to apply them in our organizations. And finally, the Kanban community has been doing a lot of work on helping organizations expand their capabilities and give them a path to adopting practices that gets them farther along the maturity model. And that's where I want to introduce you guys to the Kanban maturity model. It's a website, there's a book, it's in the beta right now, it's out there for the public to see, but we are still evolving it and trying to make it a better product. But you can find a Scrum team and what they do on the Kanban maturity model, because we could start from Scrum, but then we can show you practices and steps to take you guys' activities or your processes and your capabilities to the next level. So I would encourage you to check out the kanbanmaturityModel.com and go see where you fit and where you can go to next. And that's it. I want to say thank you guys for spending an hour with us. I'd like to thank Digite for sponsoring us and giving me a chance to share all this information with you. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out on Twitter or my email address, And check out our website at westerndevs.com.
Sure, thanks, Dave. So all of you, we encourage you to ask your questions. Once we consolidate the questions, we'll get back to you and have those answers sent back to you. Our contact addresses and resources as well. So Dave can be reached at dave@depthconsulting.ca, and you also have our blog sites as well as other resources. So thanks once again for all your time, and as I mentioned, we'll consolidate all the questions and have them posted to you. I think one of the questions that was asked was the webinar recording going to be available? Yes, webinar recordings will be made available to all of the people who attended the webinar. So with this, thank you all once again, and we would love to have you in our future webinars and look forward to seeing you again. Thanks everyone.